Welcome, ladies, gentlemen, boys, girls, thems, theys, and theirs. We hope you're having a wonderful time. This is the latest Heresy Hammer. This is going to be an interesting one today, I think, to be honest with you, Rob. Um, for those who don't know, I am John, and my fucking thing will now not cycle through the
It was going
bloody.
backwards and forwards like nobody's business before, and now
I
it's
know
given
that's
up.
because.
Oh, there
Oh,
we
there
go.
we go.
We're working on a 10-second delay.
Oh, mate, I need an edit point already. This is going completely amazing.
Write them down.
Oh, what a time. Anyway, my name's John. You'll find me on the Instagrams at D6 underscore miniatures. If you're not already following Rob, which I'll be honest with you, he's got 10 times the subscribers that we have subscribers to the channel. You're probably following Rob. Is that Meta's Miniatures? Rob, how are you? How is Heresy for you at the moment?
Yeah, good, good. I've got 20 despoilers on the table, and I've got a Ultramarines Herald and an Ultramarines Leviathan that all need to be done for the tournament in Gibraltar for next month.
Oh, for yourself.
And for myself, and I'm cutting it fine because basically what's happening is I'm working on other people's stuff during the day, and then in the evenings I'll kind of spend 1 or 2 hours kind of doing a few bits and pieces. So I'm really pleased with how it's going so far.
Hmm.
It's looking good, but I just don't want to rush it. And I fear if I don't plan it. I've got this weekend, all weekend, like it's completely free. So I'm hoping to get up at the crack of dawn on both days, go to bed late on both days, and just do as much as I can. So those are my woes at the moment. Because I suspect I'd be told off if I didn't bring the list that I said I was going to bring. I think I would
Yes.
get a real slap wrist. I think that yeah. So I've got to get it done.
You've got quite the status. You don't want to let it down, do you?
No, well, exactly right. Yes,
Well,
exactly
speaking
right.
of lists, that is a very pertinent point to raise
Yeah.
because today on episode 62, we are talking about list building. So, games can be won or lost in the movement phase, the shooting phase, the psychic phase, and the assault phase, but where they can really be won and also really be lost is in the
Yeah.
list writing phase, the math hammering phase, the
Yeah.
pre-game phases of working out what's going to work well, what's going to synergize well, what you're going to might come up against, and how you're going to deal with that. So we've had this topic on the table for such a long time
Mm.
that, but in this kind of constantly shifting meta, we thought, oh, is this the right time to do it? But we were like, no, look, we need to nail down with everyone what the core considerations are when it comes to building a Horus Heresy or 30k list and putting our thoughts down into video.
Mm.
So before we get started, what are your thoughts when it comes to this? But how do you build lists? What's your typical process?
Um, well, I've got lots of thoughts. Should we do the sponsors and then we'll go into the
Okay,
meat the
fine,
meat
fine,
of
fine,
the
fine,
yeah.
fine.
Let's do that because I've got lots to say and I don't want to be interrupted. I don't want my intellectual flow to be interrupted. You see.
Well, after we've given you some ideas for new creative lists, you can head over to Curtain Games and place an order for some plastic. You'll get really really good pricing and a phenomenal level of customer service, and you'll be helping out a wonderful shop and venue in the south of England. It's where the majority of our stuff comes from, and they recently hosted an event by a friend of the show, James from Apostate Terrain this past weekend, which
Mhm.
I've seen the
Oh yes,
pictures
that's right. Yeah, that
and
looks
it
great,
looked
doesn't it? Yeah,
looked
really good.
wonderful. So head over and see those guys. Um, if you forget who your characters are and you need some nameplates for them, or you want some upgrade kits for your tanks or your Mechanicum, or you are 8mm curious or 8mm rigid, then you can nip over to Battle Bling and pick up some upgrade kits, terrain, and accoutrements for your Titans. Don't forget to use the code Heritage Hammer at checkout as well for 10% off and let them know you came from us. And if you need a particular bit from a particular kit, you don't want to buy a whole massive box. You want someone to have done the hard work already and split out the stuff that's actually worthwhile having. Then don't forget to log on to Bits Monster and scroll through their catalog of bits and pieces. They offer free UK shipping for orders over £25. And if you use the code Heresy Hammer, all caps at checkout, you get 10% off all Horus Heresy items too. Okay, right. Initial thoughts, Rob. I'm very curious to see how you approach this because I think we're going to come at this from two completely
Yeah,
diametrically opposed points of view.
I think before I came on, as I was eating my dinner, I was thinking, ooh, I suspect that we're probably get, as you say, going to come from this from different points of view. I think my list building has changed over the course of 2.0, and I agree with you that I think Horus Heresy is a game where the game is actually just won or lost at the list building stage. It's unfortunate to say that, but I think that that's why, in general, you tend to see tougher lists than not. Is my experience at events. I think that I mean we'll get to the meat and potatoes of it. But I have totally moved away from hyper elite forces. Like Lee loves an elite force, like
Doesn't he?
proper like
Because he paints in
so
terms of
slowly.
yeah.
Exactly, like a snail. So I think that for him, having being able to create 3,000 points is feasible only when you
Mm.
have like 10 Terminators in your list or whatever.
I think you
Um,
measure Lee's painting speed in coastal erosion.
yes. Well, that's good. And whereas I take way more bodies than
Hmm.
I have ever done in like the 12 years that I've been playing Horus Heresy or however long it is now. Um, I'm quite reliant, I think, and something that's a theme of both my Alpha Legion and my Ultramarines is big, old tactical blobs with made fearless through a herald. And people often question why I would double up on the line. And it's not so much doubling up on the line, it's actually ensuring that a 20-man tack squad with a apothecary is fearless because then it becomes really difficult to shift and is almost the core with which the army kind of pivots, which is why my lists are often very susceptible to snipers. If you want to know the cheat codes for unlocking or defeating my list, then that's the way. I think the other thing that I've tended to do as time has gone on over this edition is rely a lot less on close combat. So I think that typically lots of people would have a fairly beefy close combat unit, maybe in a Spartan or in a Land Raider. I think I've I don't tend to do that much anymore. If I've got a close combat unit, it tends to be with jump packs, but sometimes I just won't bother taking a close combat unit and just rely on shooting because I feel quite strongly it's a shooting edition, and that's certainly something with the Alpha Legion that I do. Like I very rarely take any hardcore close combat. So I've put my tournament list up actually at the end of this, and I think Harry made an observation about my list that I went to a tournament in October, and he kind of said it's quite a bitty list, isn't it? There's got lots of bits to it, and I think that's a good way to describe how I list. Right, it's quite bitty. There's lots of different elements to it that synergize quite nicely. But it's also tricky for your opponent to know which one thing to focus on, and I think that that is kind of a core of my list writing. I would never dump 1,000 points into one unit. That just would not be my style at all.
That's fair. I think that's fair. I think again my approach to list writing has shifted quite a lot this edition. I would say
Mm,
at the start of the edition, I think normally I'm a little bit more thematically driven than some. I would tend to write lists that fit in with either the theme of something out of, a particular passage from a book or a book in itself, or
mm,
a way that I envisage an army playing. I think the biggest thing, however, is at the start of the edition, I was so concerned about what other people were doing. I was trying to build lists to constantly be counters.
mm,
Whereas I think as times moved on, I've become less concerned by that, and
mm,
actually now I'm more designing or thinking about list building in a way that I want to play the game. And if
mm.
if I come up against some hard counters to that, then so be it. Or if I
Yeah,
can't necessarily deal with everything, then also so be it. And
yeah.
I do think over time I've drifted away slightly from the more obviously good stuff, and I've
Yes.
tried to experiment a bit more with coming at things from a different angle, which is actually, to be fair, I think in some instances have made some of my lists a little bit more interesting for my opponents to play because they're not. I found there was a period of time, probably about a year or so ago, where you could play a 3,000 point game, and I would say that two and a bit thousand points of that was almost kind of mirrored in my what my opponent was taking.
Mm,
Or you could turn up to an event and play four games. And let's say you're playing four games against legions,
mm,
or you could almost know before your opponent took the models out of their case realistically what they were going to have. There were going to be a few little tweaks and kind of nuances here and there, but
mm,
largely I felt like it was the same relatively cookie cutter list against the same relatively cookie cutter list. And actually, that's just not how I was particularly interested in playing.
mm,
So I definitely think that I've tried to be a little bit more experimental, certainly in the last year or so.
mm,
One thing I found, we talked about this in the Death Guard show, is that playing my Death Guard as opposed to playing, I've played Iron Warriors for the bulk of the last sort of 3, 4 years.
mm,
But in an edition which is quite shooting heavy, a naturally good shooting army, it's quite hard to move yourself away from just not being railroaded into taking the obviously good choices, but you kind of want to take the good choice. Like you want to take
mm,
Iron Havocs with a Siege Breaker, and you want to take Siege Tyrants, and you want to take some heavy support squads or more interesting tanks. And actually, um, I've wanted to try and build a list. My Death Guard is, I think, the ultimate example of this, of something that's quite well rounded. I
yeah,
think it's probably a 7.5 out of 10 list as a whole.
yeah,
It's um not particularly whack, but I would say it's pretty strong in terms of I think anyone's going to give it quite a good game.
mm,
And it's probably not got too many like obvious weaknesses when you look
mm,
at um, what its abilities to deal with things like we've seen more of the meta, like Mechanicum or Solar Auxiliary, etc. as well. So I definitely think that my list writing is sort of changed a bit. I look for more for the synergies really, but more because I think it gives my army a strong backbone. And then if I want to take something like a Typhon or, another super heavy, then I can feel like I can kind of put that in the list without feeling like it's gonna kind of let things down.
yeah. Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, yeah, and of course, the thing I'm sure we will mention is the rise of Solar Auxilia in 24 and the rise of Mechanicum in 24 as well,
Yeah.
which I think that probably has had an impact on Marine players,
Oh, hugely.
um, with the kind of weapons they take. Certainly for me, I take way more heavy bolters now than
Yeah.
I ever would have done
Oh, yeah.
at the start, like in 2022.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, okay, cool. Right, well, should we get into it and then
I think so. I do think so. So, here we go. So Kerry's put this together for us. I'm just going to move our faces out of the way. Um, in news that shouldn't surprise anyone, writing an army list is one of the first actions in play a game, and as such, it can be the first step to losing the game as well. So I think this is kind of right, and I think this is one of the things when we get list submissions for our community shows. Just to
yeah,
move on to Kerry's second point here, is that the majority of time, the people that submit lists, I would say, are newer players.
yeah,
It quite often the email is quite often open with the same paragraph, which is I haven't played a lot of Horus Heresy. I've been a long-term kind of, collector of the miniatures, but I've never
yeah,
quite got into playing the game. Or I've migrated over from 40k, or I'm just starting to go to events, and I'm really worried that I'm going to write a crap list. And but often I think that's um kind of caveated with I'm not worried about losing. I just want to make sure that I give my opponent a good game,
yeah,
which I think is
yeah,
the right way of approaching where you
yeah,
need to kind of think about kind of your list building as well.
yeah. Makes sense.
So we're going to aim to look at the basics of what to consider when writing a list and the decisions that can be easily overlooked but remain so vital. So a lot of those kind of nuances and strategies is the stuff that we tend to cover in the unit deep dives over on the Patreon. So if you're not subscribed, it's probably worth subbing even for a month just to consume all the old content. It's £3, or you can get a 7-day free trial.
Yeah,
Um, But as Kerry notes at the bottom, everyone has their own way of doing this. So this is just our take. Do not treat it as gospel. We'll give you some ideas. It doesn't mean that we're always right, but we are right the majority of the time. Apart from when we're wrong, and then people love pointing out in the comments. So I suspect this comment section is going to be absolutely brutal. I spent an awful lot of the last 24 hours responding to people who go, actually, again. Yeah. Okay. So, anything to add to that before we move on?
No, I think you covered it all.
Good. Wonderful. Okay, so this is actually a really interesting way of looking at it. So, where do you write a list? So, once you've got your rulebook and your Liber in your hands, it's time to write a list. What's the best way to write it? Whereabouts do you do all of your list writing, Rob? I'm guessing Battle Scribe.
Battle Scribe, yeah, but
The
only because
worst.
it's what I know.
Yes,
I've
fair enough.
literally used it for however many years. So I hear New Recruit is very good.
I
Um,
have not
yeah,
come across this.
no,
So,
I've heard it's really really good. But I don't know if you need access to the internet to be able to write lists. Just as a yeah.
ooh,
So
okay.
yeah,
So I'll be honest with you, I'm a quartermaster guy, have
yeah.
been for, well, since I got into the game, what, 8, 9 years ago. So I've always been, yeah, 2015, but yeah, so yeah, 10 years this year.
Okay.
Always been a quartermaster fan. I think it's largely brilliant. It is only available on iOS, which is a bit of a shame. I don't hate the battle scribe in the way it works. What I do hate is I hate the way it formats things.
Yes, that is a massive pain. Yeah.
The data input, excellent. The data output, horrific for the eyes.
Yes, yeah, it's not good. You need there are ways to slim down
Mm,
Quartermaster, but tends to be when people share lists, they don't kind of like slim it
yeah,
down. They add all the options, and it just makes it look a little bit
yeah.
frenetic. But yeah, the only thing I would say about Excel and paper is that you actually need a good, strong basis in numbers. You need to be able to be
Oh yeah,
numerate. And it sounds it might lots of people watching this tend to be quite well educated, and many of them will have degrees, I have no doubt, but not everybody does, and who does wargaming. So, and I think that if you use Excel and you use pen and paper, I think that you probably you need to be confident in your numeracy skills. So, I would say that like Battle Scribe or something like that, you can rely on that to add up your points for you. Um,
yeah,
without needing to check it too much is all I would say. I know
yeah.
lots of people who use Excel, but for me I just I stick to Battlescribe.
It's not for me. I think as well, you typically tend to find with things like New Recruit, Battle Scribe, Quartermaster, etc., that all of the options are laid out as well,
Hmm.
and there don't tend to be any mistakes. I find it's quite
Hmm.
easy to make mistakes with
Yeah,
utilizing like Excel or pen and paper because you
yeah,
think, oh yeah, this can definitely take this, and actually you get to the table
yeah,
and someone's like,
yeah,
why
yeah,
have your veteran
yeah,
squad in a
yeah,
dedicated Proteus? And you're like, well, of
yeah.
course they can take a Proteus, but
That's a good point. That's a good point. And I think Battlescribe does flag up where something's gone wrong. It does kind of like tell you. Not, I
yeah,
don't rely on that too much, but lots of these list building things are able to kind of flag up where
where
you've
you've
got a
maybe,
master, you've got a right of
yeah,
war, but you've got no master of the Legion, right, or something
yeah.
like that. Yep.
And tends to be these things are either free to utilize or a small one-off transactional
Yeah,
fee, which
yeah, yeah,
like
yeah,
I mean I've probably written 1,000 lists in Quartermaster. I've probably got 300 saved to my phone currently. Like
yeah,
it's been worth
yeah,
every penny. So
yeah.
I would wholeheartedly recommend the list building app. I think it just takes a lot of the complexity out of writing lists.
Yeah,
And
agreed.
if you've got a bit of an idea for a list and you're going for a poo at the same time, you can just whip out the phone and just
That's how 90% of lists are written, isn't it? I
I
think.
would say so, yeah. Jot a little list down as well.
That's why loads of men have deep vein thrombosis, I think, is just sitting on the toilet, too much writing lists.
Absolutely. That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
So, okay, things to bear in mind. So, the force org chart. Now, this is your
Yeah.
typical
Yeah.
primary.
So I put this in just to add in. I put this in because I suspect we've got lots of hardened, grizzled veterans probably watching this,
Yeah.
and who subscribe to our Patreon, are big in our community. But I did think actually maybe we should just go back to first principles
Oh, 100% agree.
with
Could
this one,
not agree
and
more.
just go right through. Actually, where do we start with list writing? Right.
Yeah.
Cool.
So, you start off with an an HQ and two what is often referred to as compulsory troops. So you have to take two troops and your HQ in your primary detachment. Secondary detachments and allied detachments will have their own force org charts, but typically you need an HQ who has to be compulsory, which does in theory rule out certain like console choices. For
Hmm.
instance, you can't have a
Hmm.
Moritat as your
No, you can
compulsory
have a you
HQ.
can have a Moritat. You can have a
Oh,
Moritat.
you can have a
You
Moritat. You're
used to
right.
you
You used to be
used
able
to be
to
able
not,
to,
but yeah,
but
sorry.
yeah,
Apologies.
there's some you can't take.
Um, and then two compulsory troops. Now, it's worth bearing in mind as well, these troops don't have to have line. So a compulsory troop doesn't necessarily mean that it has to have like line. So,
Hmm.
for instance, in my Death Guard list, I've got a compulsory veteran squad and a tactical squad make up my two compulsory troop choices.
Hmm.
But there are certain units that cannot be taken as compulsory troops choices. Um, that will normally be denoted by rights of war or other rules, such as the support squad rule,
Hmm.
for
Hmm.
instance. So,
What so really there are for your compulsory troops you're looking at a couple of units really. So tactical marines, which are just marines armed with bolters
yeah,
that you can take, breacher squads, which are marines armed with shields, and then assault squads, which are marines armed with jump
with
packs.
jump
Those
packs.
tend to be, if you're not using a right of war, those three things tend to be the kind of like
Yeah.
troop
And if
sort of
you're
stuff.
a Mechanican player, you're probably going to see Thalax, Thralls, or potentially Castellax as well. So,
Yes, yes.
and then for your solar players, it's going to be standard bullshit las gun or las rifle wielding like tertios. So,
Yeah, yeah.
okay, you can then expand that out to a maximum of six troops and three HQs. You then move into your elites, where you'd have up to four elites, which is interesting that they give you more elite slots. You then have the lesser spotted fast attack, made up of three heavy supports, which is a particularly congested
Mm,
um, set of uh, set of units. And then you can also take within the primary detachment a fortification and potentially a Primarch 2.
yes. Now, what I didn't include on this is a Lord of
Lord of
War
War.
or
Yeah,
an allied detachment, which you can take, but we're just I think for this conversation today, I think it's probably worth us just sticking to
I agree.
the primary. Yeah, it's interesting about elites. Just to go back on that, elites are definitely congested.
Yeah,
I find HQ slots recently I found particularly
yeah.
congested because I just love
Love
taking HQs.
Heralds.
They're they've got a lot of utility, got a lot of
Yeah.
function, and yeah, just massively useful. So yeah, I've definitely
See, for
found that
me,
it's
I
tough
never
to.
seem to max out my HQ slots.
No,
But heavy
I
support slots, I'm like, God, I could do with
can't get
nine.
enough of them. Well, the
Just give me
Death
nine.
Guard solved that one, don't they?
Yeah, take away the old fast attack. Just give me some more heavy supports.
Yeah, yeah.
Bullshit. Okay, interesting questions that Kerry's posed here. First decision in writing a list. What is the theme? Why is this an important question to ask, and why is it asked first, Rob?
So, um, Horus Heresy is a game that is largely based on the books, the Black Library novels. Those were the real inspiration. I understand that the Badab War kind of like really kind of kicked things all off in the sense that that was the precursor to the Horus Heresy. But the any conversation we have about the Horus Heresy always needs to go back to the Black Library novels and the Black Books and the Visions of Heresy books. So lots of people you'll find get into the Horus Heresy because they love the story, and particularly they love the characters. Your Lokans, your Shibukan, your Hibukans, and
Yeah,
your Primarchs in particular. What person hasn't got into Horus Heresy and started off and made sure that there's a Primarch, Primarch in there.
yeah,
Um, so that's obviously linked with theme, and the one I always kind of like go to as like a go-to theme and explaining kind of why themes is so good is World Eater's army based on the destruction of Armatura when they launched the Shadow Crusade, right?
oh,
Led by Khan, and I think that that is such a cool theme. Destroyed city, dead Ultramarines everywhere, and just like berserkers running around chopping things in half. And I think that's just such a good thing because it was such a good book and it was such an awesomely it was a character driven book as well, seen through the eyes of Khan. Um, and I think that's just such a good example of where you can build a whole army in Horus Heresy around a theme. And actually, in fairness, the Rites of War do a great job of
Well,
around
this is the thing,
theming
right?
forces as well.
That particular example of Armatura sort of like answers the first four questions that are posed here. So, do you build it around a specific story or time era from the lore?
Yeah,
Do you build it around a specific character, and do you build it around a specific rite of war? So these are all
yeah,
kind of key considerations, but
yeah.
all can potentially interlink as well. And I do genuinely think that if you put effort into really thinking about what kind of where you this army is in the timeline or
Yeah.
in the galaxy and what it's up to and what it's doing and who's leading it and what's going to be involved, you'll earn a lot of kind of clout and a lot of brownie points from people because they'll look at it and instantly go, oh, I like get this. This is this and this is that, and then you can kind of
Yeah.
lean into that quite heavily with the units that you choose as well,
Mm.
and that will really, for me, I think more often than not, that's what forms the backbone of a lot of my list writing.
I think that's a really good really
Yeah,
good one. I always start whenever I have conversations about commissions with potential clients or clients, where do you see this force fighting? That tends to be the first question I always ask.
yeah,
Because that will give great indication about what's on the bases, what kind of basing scheme you're going for,
yeah.
how worn and weathered those guys are. Because lots of, it's not just your list writing, but it's also will link into your painting, your weathering, your battle damage, your basing as well. So, it's all tied together in a way, perhaps that you perhaps in 40K it isn't because the story is just so important to the background of the Horus Heresy.
I completely agree. Completely agree. Um, do you build it around certain must-have units, either because they're good or just because you enjoy using them?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, isn't it? I mean, I first thought of like Raven Guard, right? Sorry, yeah, Raven Guard, and Dark Furies, those are a really good because in that way you kind of work backwards. You kind of
Yeah.
and you kind of go, okay, I want Deliverers in my force, I want Dark Furies in my force because I know they're really good. They can both deep strike, therefore I'm going to take a large deep striking element in my force.
Hmm.
Therefore
Probably
I'm going to
need a master of signals and
yeah, and
yeah.
all these things, right? And that's almost like for me, if you're taking something, Galvor back, Dark Furies, those kind of things, it's almost working backwards in that way and kind of going, okay, well, I want these to be the mainstay of my force, and then build a list around those, which I think is perfectly valid. And if it's if it's Galvor back you're including, then it might that again links to the story. You might kind of go, it's a force led by Argol Tal on Isfan 5, right?
Yeah.
So I think in that one, I would always. For me, I would always tend to work backwards. So include those units first, and then
Yep.
build everything around that would synergize and work well.
Yep. Good. Great idea. Have you just finished painting a new unit and want to see how they do?
Yeah,
Brackets just prepare for new model syndrome.
yeah,
For
I
anyone
know.
who's not aware, new model syndrome is the first time that you spend tens of hours lovingly, painstakingly assembling and
Yeah.
painting something, getting it ready for the battlefield. You put it down and it'll instantly either do nothing or be destroyed immediately. So
Yeah, I've had that before. I think that is probably actually less about the new model and more about you not knowing how to use it
yeah, I think
properly.
there's a bit of that.
I think that's what actually, if a scientific study would actually happen on this, I honestly think it's about you
What
not
about a
knowing.
philosophical one?
Yeah, well, and that as well. Not
Yeah,
knowing how to hide it, where to hide it, how to use it, how adventurous you should be. And I
yeah,
think after 10 games, you'll learn how to use it appropriately.
yeah. Or, and there's nothing wrong with this, do you just want a list that kicks dicks in?
Yeah, this is an interesting one because the tournament scene in Horus Heresy in the UK is actually it's not it's not too prevalent. I mean, most events are really just pick up games, with a few narrative events thrown in. Um, I think that at this moment in time, tournaments aren't a massive thing, but I think linking back to what you said before, you probably want a list always to have a little bit of bite because you don't want to be steamrollered.
Yeah,
Um, and but I don't necessarily think people need to worry about this too much. But I think it's always important to build a list, just thinking, actually, am I equipped to deal with most um, most other armies, I think
Yeah,
is something I would say.
I think that's
Yeah.
totally fair. And then this is the caveat at the bottom. The video is going to focus on five core pillars of building an effective list. So
Mm,
scoring, mobility, punching, countering, and contingencies.
yeah.
Okay, so without further ado, scoring. Hey Rob, have you ever turned up to an event without any scoring units?
Never, never,
Have you
never.
seen someone do that?
Uh, yes.
Yes,
Matt Woodley and his tank army. That's right. Yeah.
correct. Yeah,
So yeah, that's right. And then he was completely hamstrung for the entirety of the event.
yeah.
He just couldn't do anything for
Couldn't
the
do anything.
event.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he was
Yeah. Okay.
hoping constantly playing for draws.
Yeah, exactly right. Well, why don't you tell us about scoring and what your thoughts are on scoring? Because in my head, I'm very clear about what I do with scoring for every single list.
Okay, interesting. So, for starters, we'll read through the notes and then we'll have a wider
Yeah.
discussion. So every mission in the game, with the exception of kill points, is won or lost on objectives.
Yeah.
Therefore, if you want to actually play the mission, your choice of line units and how many you take will be vital.
Yeah.
Okay, so the reason being is that only line units can score. Other units can deny scoring, but only line units can actually score objectives. So you need to be considerate about taking units with the line special rule. So they will
Yeah.
either have line inbuilt,
Yeah.
or they might be able to gain line with the addition of things like banners. So certain units like elite terminators can quite often be bodyguards and can upgrade to have a banner. That's
Yeah.
normally a very worthwhile thing to take because
Yeah.
it then adds another dimension into their play, or by adding something, as Rob suggested, like a herald, for instance, who is the independent character who has the banner, who's just had some phenomenal new models released as well. So
Yeah. Yeah.
we'll see heralds no doubt become even more prevalent. How many line units are optimal? So this is Kerry's personal choice. A minimum of 1+1 per every 1,000 points. I
Mm,
think that is the absolute bare minimum.
So he's
Um,
saying four in a 3K list, is
four
it?
in a 3K.
Yeah.
Are they kept cheap and basic, or do you invest in them to make them more useful beyond just sitting of their objective or game? I think that's a
Mm,
very interesting question to ask.
yes.
And for end of game scoring, how do you keep them alive long enough to be useful? So
Mm, okay. There's lots to I mean, we could do a whole show on this, I think,
I
and
think I
unpack this.
think we probably would. So I will
Yeah.
quickly tell you what I
Go for
like
it.
to
Yeah.
do. So I think at 3K, I'd want a minimum of four scoring units. I
Yeah.
think any less is personally, you don't tend to see more than six objectives in a game. And I think the
Yeah.
ability to score more than half the objectives is kind of key.
Hmm.
I would tend to have a mixture of scoring units in my list. I like to have
Hmm.
something that is quite survivable.
Hmm.
I've actually started to use both in my Iron Warriors and my Death Guard actually
Hmm.
elite Terminators, either with a banner or paired with a Herald.
Hmm.
For instance, I find that Siege Tyrants make a phenomenal like deck chair. Um,
They are very good. Very
Deck
good in
chair
that
often,
way.
by the way, will refer to as like a pseudonym for like a backfield objective holder, someone who just sits on an objective and doesn't really move off it. That's kind of their job, is to sort of
Yeah.
guarantee that, or as much as possible, guarantee that objective is held for as long as possible. I tend to have something like a big-ish tactical squad because they're just relatively survivable, especially with things like Heart of the Legion and an apothecary in there. And they're pretty versatile. You know, they're relatively inexpensive, they're relatively maneuverable. Um, and then I would tend to have something with a bit more punch to go and take and hold my opponent's objectives as well.
Mm,
So something like in the Death Guard, for instance, I've got a character with some Death Shroud who have a banner. So their job is to kind of pile forwards, clear off my opponents off of their objectives, and then take those objectives.
yeah.
And then I also like to take normally something that can infiltrate onto an objective as well, just to help mitigate any issues we might have in terms of mobility, movement, etc. So a recon squad is a good example for me.
Mm, yeah, that's good. That's sound and sage advice. So a couple of things to pick out here. I think that exactly as Kerry's described, you really want minimum of four in a 3K list, but any more is good.
Yeah,
I
don't be afraid
think,
of taking more. Don't like if you think, oh, I'm taking
yeah,
five line units, like don't worry about it.
yeah.
You'll be fine.
I think one of the problems with the line units, tactical squads to spoilers, is that there are quite a lot of hard work to paint because
Hmm.
they're quite monotonous. And therefore, I think the tendency always is to be like, I'm just going to make them as minimum size as I can, and then
Yeah.
I'm going to paint all the sexy stuff that I want,
Yeah.
like my tanks.
Yeah.
They've just come out all in plastic, or my like new command squads or whatever, and then I'll do all the sexy stuff. But I would really implore anybody starting out in Heresy, try and make those tac squads, those breacher squads, try and make them, 15 man minimum. It
Yeah.
just gives you a little bit of flexibility if you don't want to put them in a rhino when you want them on foot. And and that's always the thing I used to find, which is that I didn't spend long enough in those initial exciting stages of a project, kind of just building up massed infantry and then doing all the sexy toys, and then just kind of like did the bare bones, and then you're always going to struggle in that way. So I wod say really invest in trying to almost like kind of go, I'm going to do 60 infantry line models. That's four squads of 15, and then that will stand me in good stead to be able to kind of have lots of different iterations of line units on foot, make them smaller, go in rhinos, etc., etc. So that would be my advice. So for myself, um I would always tend to take one massive unit. And I would always tend to stick an apothecary in there to make them survivable. So Tac
Yep.
Marines and Despoilers are a good example of this. If they're standing on objective, they get a +1 to their feel no pain, which is their kind of like the apothecary trying to save them. So they'll often stand on objective, and then they get their armor save, usually a 3 up, and then a 4 up feel no pain. So you're running a 3 up, 4 up to try and save them. So that does make them super survivable, and actually they're pretty darn cheap. And your opponent has to put in a lot of effort to be able to either get rid of them or force morale checks. Is kind of what I would say. So whatever I build a list, the core of it is always a 15 to 20 man tac squad, the spoiler squad, and then from there, I like to have two 10 man tac squads in rhinos, because that goes back to, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later. That goes back to maneuverability. For the Ultramarines, I'll talk about a little bit another reason why I would take rhinos. But just having a rhino that can move 7, you can then get out 7, just gets you to where you need to be.
Yeah.
And so I think that, whenever I'm building lists, that's always the core of the list. That one big squad, and then two rhinos with tac squads in. And then, exactly as you say, it's always useful to have things that can infiltrate or scout onto objectives, because it means you can deny early on, or you can start grabbing objectives from that first turn if the mission allows you to do that. And then we obviously have, exactly as you say, other forms of line. So you mentioned the command squad. So I know people who absolutely love command squads. I've taken them before. I always find myself in a bit of a dilemma with command squads, because they're kind of like this thing where they can be scoring and they should be scoring, but also they should be killing stuff as well. So I often find I am not a player who really likes units doing two things and dual things. I kind of often like my units to be doing, they have one purpose and one purpose only. Tac squads are there to to score basically. I'll often sacrifice shooting in order to run to get to where I need to be. So that's, I always feel a bit jittery about command squads, and kind of a bit like, oh, I don't know how I feel about it. But obviously, adding a herald to a unit kind of gets around that, particularly in the last moments of the game when you need to kind of like run onto an objective or get onto an objective. But yeah, I think the advice that Kerry's given there is sound, minimum of 4, but please, just if you're getting into Horus Heresy, just commit to doing like 40 infantry,
Yeah.
50 infantry, 60 infantry first. Get that done out of the way, and you've got a great basis for any list that you
Yeah, I
write.
agree.
And just
Yeah.
I know it's tough. I know it's going to be a slog, but just commit to it.
I think that's also quite a pertinent point as well. You'll typically tend to find that I would say a lot of my list writing has got like a similar backbone to it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like there's not, I tend to have, again, Iron Warriors is normally I have a big tac squad on foot, two tac squads in rhinos, and I don't find I'm writing too many lists that haven't got those. They're kind of like
Yes.
almost like auto includes.
Same for me. Yeah, same
So
for
I
me.
think that's definitely a pertinent point. But yeah, so scoring super important.
Yeah, I think just one other thing. There
Hmm.
are legions that I think will break some of those rules. So, the most obvious one would be a Blood Angels list.
Yep.
Lots of the buffs are to do like Rights of War buffs, Deep Strike come from the fact that they've got Warhawk jump pack. So it makes more sense that their line would be in the form of Assault
Submarines.
Marines.
Yeah.
Um, but that's because some Rights of War and buffs, and on top of that, their Legion Advance reaction
Mm.
forces you down in a certain direction to get them to get the most out of things. So I suppose like
Yeah.
this is for the majority of legions, but there are some
It's worth
exceptions.
bearing in mind as well. There are just so many more options with legions than there are with Mechanicum and Solar.
Yes,
So
yes.
if you don't find that we're kind of focusing on those two armies, it's not because we only care about legions. It's just because you've got so you, a lot of the kind of backbone for Mechanicum and Solar List does kind of write itself
Mm,
because they are the options in the book. Whereas with Marines and with Legions and with the way that Rights of War have such a big effect on list building, how things fit into the Force Org slots, we are naturally just going to end up talking more about the Legions than the Mech and Solar.
I mean,
Don't worry, we haven't
we've only
forgotten
just
about you.
done a 8-part show on Mechanicum
Yeah,
anyway,
so
so yeah.
yeah, exactly. Don't think that we don't like Mechanicum. We do. I'm sat here with a Mechanicum allied detachment assembled in front of me, so don't you worry. But yeah, if you want more Mechanicum, head over to the Patreon. It's all there. Okay, cool. So mobility games. Once you've got the game started, games can be won or lost in the movement phase. So why is it so important? So most units that sit back and wait for the enemy to come to them are probably going to have a bad time. Yeah. Units need to move, whether it's to get into range, get into combat, or just move onto objectives. So you need to be considerate there.
Mm,
Do your units want to transport? Do you have separate fast elements to support slower ones? That's a very interesting point to raise, I think. Do slow, heavy foot sloggers have a means to make themselves useful? I personally think they do. And mobility doesn't mean movement on the board. You can outflank or deep strike to get where you need to be.
mm, yeah.
So I personally think that the often overlooked element is the slow, heavy foot sloggers do have a means to make themselves useful. And I've really
Mm,
come to the conclusion that actually, yeah, they really, really do. Um, if you are an Iron Hands player, for instance, you are going to be used to taking big blocks of breaches and potentially immortals as
mm,
well.
mm,
Slow units, but an absolute nightmare to shift off objectives. Like I said, I've kind of got into recently using heavy terminators paired with a herald, or heavy terminators that are able to take a banner potentially as really, really good back and midfield objective holders. I think oft people have got into a habit of using a cheap unit to sit on a backfield objective, which has got no defense, no cover, and can quite often be removed from the objective either by shooting them off and therefore they're not claiming anything, or just knocked off and having that objective taken. Um, Anything in here that springs out to you, Rob, that you want to
yeah.
raise?
So mobility is interesting. And I think most of my conversation is probably going to link with around transport. So
Go for it.
I've found, so I also play Alpha Legion, played a lot of it in the past couple of years. I often find with armies that can infiltrate or scout, that there's less need to take transports because you start the game often where you need to be, or at
Yeah, I
least very much closer to where
think
you
that's
need to
very
be.
fair.
Transports, I think, are in this weird place at the moment, which they can be good as gunboats. They can be good for transporting models around the board and getting to places where they need to do quickly. But they are also utter death traps because they explode at strength 8 and then they cause pinning
Hmm.
to everything around them as well. So I think that transports are probably not an auto take, especially as I say, if you can infiltrate scout would be my first thought. Um, in terms of, and again, this links to transports, I'm often in a dilemma around kind of like mobility, which is that a 15-man tack squad, going linking back to what we were saying before, I probably wouldn't buy them a transport, but what I would be considering is that I do need to make them more survivable by adding an apothecary to them. So it's fine if you go on foot, but if things are going on foot, what are you adding to them to make them more survivable? Because they're just so much more susceptible to firepower really. So adding an apothecary is often a good alternative to saying putting something in a rhino. Um, I think mobility, of course, is important. I definitely favor like having for my Ultramarines, I often have one 10-man assault squad, keep it fairly bare bones, and that is purely to bully other like tac squads and things like that, recon Marines, but also really just to hop around and jump and go grab objectives as and where
Yep.
I need to, especially in missions where you grab an objective and then it disappears. That's massively useful.
Yeah.
And just having one little assault squad, it's not too much of a threat to your opponent, so your opponent probably won't kind of target out. There's probably more concerning things like a Leviathan Dreadnought or a Contemptor bearing down on you. Um, but I think that I think that's massively useful. It's interesting about heavy units. So heavy units, as you said, can't run. Leviathan will be one that lots of people will take. Number one, because it's high points, so it fills out points early on. So
Yep.
especially if you're getting into Horus Heresy, you kind of look at a Leviathan and go, "This looks pretty good," and it's like 300
It
points. So I'm gonna
yeah,
take. I'm
and
gonna
it's
take it.
£40. So like it's
Exactly.
that trifecta, isn't it? It's good.
Yeah,
It fills up a lot of points. It's fun to
yeah.
paint.
Yes.
The court factor, and
Yeah,
it's not particularly expensive to
no,
buy.
no, not at all. But the other thing I would say though, because it is slow, I think one of the things is that you might want to gear it up more for shooting than for close combat. An entirely
Hmm.
close combat built Leviathan Dreadnought, you kind of go, that's gonna struggle to get up the board
Yeah.
quickly. You can't rely on running at all. You can use some movement reactions, but really you move it, I think 3 inches because I think it's -1 because it's heavy.
Yeah.
Um, so kitting it out for longer ranges is good, unless as Kerry says, you can deep strike it. You put it in a Charybdis, you put it in a Dreadclaw.
Put in a Mastodon.
Yeah, exactly, and then you can get to where you need to be to be quicker. So I think that if you are not choosing transports of things, think about how to make it more survivable. Think about whether you're kitting it out for shooting, because you need to get there and then you need to get there safely as well. Is kind of what I would say, but also, most TAC Marines with a character, or whatever, they can run 11 inches, which is actually is actually pretty
Pretty
far
good.
as well.
Pretty good.
Um, yeah, and then the only last thing I would say is don't underestimate units. With Scout. So Scout isn't like Infiltrate. Scout can confer. So if you put a Vigilator with a unit, that unit can then scout 6 inches, and 6 inches is a whole turn for a Leviathan to move, right? It's actually a
Yeah.
fair amount. It's actually a long way.
Yeah, it
So
really is.
you put them with a tac squad, and then it's scouting, and then they've got like a weapon skill 5 character, ballistic skill
Yeah.
5 character with them as well.
And
So that's
a
something to consider.
13-inch move essentially in that first game turn and the ability to shoot, or
Yep.
like a 17-inch move if you need to be able to jump onto a, oh no, sorry, it's 18-inch move because it's highest initiative, isn't it? So 18-inch
Blah, 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 blah. No, I think for runs, I think it's majority or lowest. I think.
Do we want to check it, or shall we
No,
just
no,
gloss over
let's
it and
no,
hope
no.
for the best?
Consolidations, I think is highest, and I think for like reactions, I think it's and
I
runs, I
think
think it's lowest. But
okay.
tell us in the comments below. Go on. I'll have a look
Okay,
at my
cool.
rule book in a second.
Right, mobility. So, is there anything else that we want to add on, or are we saying
No,
you
I
want to
think I think
consider
that's
having mobile units? You want to consider having a good degree of mobility in your list, but also don't
oh yeah,
write off units that aren't particularly mobile because actually they can have
yeah, yeah, yeah,
other uses.
yeah.
I
I
tend to
think
find
yeah.
actually mobile but slow, if that makes sense. So things like Leviathans, elite,
Mm,
like things like Siege Tyrants, etc.,
mm,
etc., make
yeah.
quite good screens for your and deterrents for things coming in to try and attack your backfield stuff. Things like
Hmm.
heavy support squads,
Mm,
Scorpiuses, etc., etc., that
yeah.
are a bit more fragile.
It's interesting actually because one of the things we haven't discussed is let's imagine that in a 3,000 point list, 2,000
Hmm.
of those points is just dedicated to shooting. You got heavy sports teams, you got
Yeah,
Scorpius, as you say. Um, and that is just basically your gun line that just sits and castles up and shoots at your opponent. You're going to do really well in kill point missions, and your opponent's going to have to come to you if they want to deal with you. But you are like, if you roll a mission where there's, six objective markers, you need some maneuverability to be able to get
yeah,
places. So just having like a gun line isn't going to cut the mustard on many, many missions. So I think that just bear that one in mind, which is that when if you go to an event or you're rolling up for a mission, you always need a list that can do a little bit of everything, I think, and
that's what I
mobility is
think.
one of the pillars.
I completely and utterly concur. Punch. Right. An army that has no offense is never going to win. Your army needs to be able to fight back. Where does your army's punch come from? Examples: a Death Star unit, a particularly effective array of shooting, a deep strike or sudden outflank, multiple smaller effective units in assault, or is the unit there just to kill, or is it enough to just distract and draw attention away from other things and hold up your enemy's advance, aka the tar pit?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a particularly interesting set of questions to ask. So, likewise, you need to be able to survive, but likewise, you need to be able to dish out some pain as well. And I think personally, this is where you start to see the same things time and time again in the majority of lists. There are meta choices from an output perspective, and I think it's very, very easy for people to default to them. Would you agree?
Yes, I would agree with that.
Okay.
Yes.
So, taking a Legion army as our kind of basis here, then,
Mm.
what things do you often see come up time and time again in a list when it comes to output? And moreover, why?
So
Give me a few things.
should we focus on shooting first, or do you want to do close combat
Let's do
first?
shooting first, because I think it's a
Yeah.
much broader topic.
Okay. So I think that s melter guns on mobile chassis such as contemptors or gravis belters is
Yeah,
massively useful.
and predators as
Um,
well with
yeah, predators, yeah,
autocannons.
absolutely. I think are always going to be something you're going to tend to see. It's the strength eight. It's doubling out. It's useful to get really useful against tanks. It's the tanks are so vulnerable to these mobile melter. And I think that's going to be something that you would often see in a list. I think that heavy sports squads. I think you're always going to nine times out of ten you're going to see people taking heavy support squads unless a right of war restricts heavies in some way. There are, I think, I would lump l- rapiers in with heavy support squads as well. I
Yeah,
would just kind of like you know, they dish out a lot of firepower. They can sit behind an Aegis defense line. They can sit in cover. They're good. They're good for the amount of points, although susceptible because they've still got 3+ armor.
and they can't
Um,
react unlike the heavy support squad can as well. So
but a heavy support squad, they can also take gear like augury scanners
yeah, Nunciovox
and Nuncio
or
Vox, and
Vixilla, and
yeah,
attach a character to them as well.
yeah.
So
So I think that those things are going to be fairly typical in lists, if somewhat uncreative. And I'm also guilty of taking such things. You shall see in my list a little bit later. Um, and then I think that Contemptor dreadnoughts with any kind of long range weapon is always also going to be really popular. The Contemptor dreadnought is an interesting one because it's got a 2-up, 5-up, so it's got a 2-up save on and then a 5-up invuln. So it's very survivable. It's on a mobile chassis.
mm,
It's actually
really mobile.
you need to put a lot in to killing a
Hmm.
Contemptor like in one turn. So that they're always going to be popular. Can you think of any more? Any more example? I mean, sure,
I mean, the
it's going to be
Scorpius is
loads,
the
right?
other
But
one as well that I
yeah,
tend
yeah.
to kind of and again I tend to take quite a lot in my lists.
Mm.
Yeah, a couple of what, 300, 250 points, and you
Yeah,
can dish out an awful lot of pain and hurt. The fact that you can fire indirectly as well,
yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah. I
so you
think
can
yeah,
effectively hide them and screen them with terrain or other units, and then still
yeah,
be able to kind of dish out max firepower.
yeah. I and then in terms of the close combat, which I think this is probably this slide is kind of specifically talking about. So I think there's going to be common themes just in a generic list. So the common things I think you're going to find are going to be command squads for your close combat, and
Hmm.
the reason for that is their weapon skill 5. So
Yeah,
most things they're either
and
going
they're
to be hitting
scoring.
and they're scoring. They're hitting on 4s or they're hitting on 3s. They got a fairly good damage output. They're 2 wounds apiece, and and they are more survivable than say veterans, the lesser seen veterans, because they've all got a 2-up save as well.
Mm.
Um, so that's what makes them really popular, and often you would see those in the list, and actually they're pretty good, as John says, they're scoring. You're often going to see contemptors, like I would say 95% of lists, if not 99% of lists, has a contemptor in some way, and lots of people, most people, will
The
take a Gravis
Contemptor
Powerfist.
is the ultimate like filler in. Like, what is the gap in your army? Like, what is your, if you look at a list and it's 2,800 points and you're thinking, what is my army lacking? Is it lacking close combat punch? Bang a contemptor in there
Yeah.
with two fists. Is it lacking some range anti-tank? Maybe I'll put either dual las cannons or dual gravis melter in there.
Mm.
Am I lacking something to deal with like massed or kind of like multi-wound toughness 5? Do I play a lot of
Mm.
Mechanicum, for instance? You might
Mm.
go, well, I'll bang a double conversion beamer
Yeah.
contemptor in there and stick him in the back of the board and waste those
Yeah.
merms from distance. So
Yeah.
he is the ultimate Swiss Army knife, really, isn't he?
Yeah, yeah. I think that the number of options that can be taken on a
Yeah,
contemptor it means that they're just generally seen because they can fill exactly as John said, they can fill any gap that you need them to fill. And then the same goes for the Leviathan Dreadnought, which is
hmm,
we have talked about it being slow, but actually a good option is to give it one close combat weapon like a claw due to the brutal, and then one shooting weapon, and typically that's going to be a cyclonic melter lance. Um,
yeah. If you're
but
taking one, it's
yeah,
going to be a cyclonic melter
yeah,
lance.
not always. I think like Iron Warriors players would struggle with choosing like a sundering auto cannon, right? Because it's
The
strength 8. But
difficulty is with the in that specific example is, and I can tell you this from experience, one storm cannon cannot be relied upon to open up
yeah,
like
a Land
completely
Raider,
open down
right?
a land
Yeah,
raider,
yeah,
whereas two can take
ultimately
down
do it.
a unit of predators or
Yeah,
a unit of Sicarans or a Spartan in one turn pretty
yeah,
effectively. So
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's
yeah,
interesting.
I think that's
Um,
the exception
yeah.
proves the rule. Is that I say every legion can get away with mixing and matching apart from Iron Warriors because you just want to take two storm cannons.
Yeah, yeah. I think also like so those are the kind of things that you might call upon just in a generic list for punch. But of course, you then have Legion specific units, which is often where people add flavor, but also add a lot of close combat punch. With
Yeah,
there are of course exceptions, like when we're talking about like shooting. So Iron Havocs, for example, Siege Tyrants, they're really all close. They're all shooting, not close combat. More Dathan are close combat, but most Legion units are really kind of like close
yeah,
combat orientated, and that's where often you'd add in, um, yeah, a lot of flavor and your close combat.
yeah.
I don't tend to take too much close combat though, and what I prefer to do is actually just tie my let's say a Leviathan. I'd be quite happy to throw a fearless 15-man tack squad against a Leviathan, knowing that I would have no hope of winning that combat, but also knowing that they could only kill 3 or 4 things a turn. 3 or 4 models a turn, and because they're fearless, they're never going to. He's not that Leviathan is just so slowed that um, I'm quite happy for it to not be kind of like wrecking the rest of my army. So there is an option, which is that you just tar pit units as opposed to just trying to beat things in close combat, which is definitely more of a strategy that I use nowadays.
That's
Yeah, I've
really
got
interesting.
yeah,
Really interesting. See, I like to have now in the majority of this I write something that can deal with those target units in close combat.
Ah,
So
right, yeah,
the
yeah.
so I tend to I find I found certainly big attack squads and bigger units of despoilers specifically become more and more prevalent in the last kind of
Mm,
9 to 10 months.
mm,
Um, and actually, like I said, that my unit of like three Death Shroud with their flag and their character is just so good at removing those 15-20 man attack
mm.
squads off objectives and
Yeah,
then just claiming that objective. And that's kind of what they do, really. They
yeah,
can reliably
yeah.
kill 12 guys in a single combat and
Yeah, that's
then
interesting,
chase the rest down.
yeah, that's true. That I mean that is a good point. But
I think
you know,
that's lesser
if we
spotted, certainly.
yes, but if we're talking about like say a contemptor, I mean a contemptor is a great example to throw a fearless tax squad at it because you're just
Yeah,
like you might have brutal three, but you've only got three attacks,
yeah,
and like you're going to miss with one of those,
yeah,
and you're killing two guys, and I'm
yeah.
quite happy to just get you tied
Sacrifice
up.
two guys a turn. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, exactly, and that's it, and that's it. Yeah, so it is interesting. I think also a Death Star unit, just to come onto that one. So, you know, again, this is particularly for new players. The temptation will always be to add like a Primarch to your boy band. You're kind of like your Phoenix Terminators and then put them all in a Spartan because they're mobile, survivable, and can get to where they need to be.
mm,
But I think one of the things I would say about that is that that's a lot of points in one unit.
yep,
Um, and while you're rocking around with your 1,000 point tank, your opponent's probably picking off other parts of your army and
hmm
trying probably to stay away from that Death Star unit. That's the thing about a Death Star unit, is that sometimes it's quite easy to stay away from it. Often these things are heavy because they're in cataphractii armor, so you can just kind of run away from it, as far as you can. What I think is a better option, if you're thinking of taking something like a Primarch, is to dump them. And again, I know I've talked about this a lot, but dump them with a despoiler squad. Your Primarch can take and weather the fire of las cannons and melter shots. They often either have a 3 up or a 4 up. If they're standing on objective with despoilers, they still get Heart of the Legion. They'll get a nice little tasty 6 up, feel no
yeah. It's
pain,
crazy, isn't it?
and you can afford to lose a couple of wounds on your Primarch because it will not die, so they can come back. And those despoilers are really just a scoring ablative wound.
Yeah,
Yeah, they are essentially ablative wounds, and a Primarch can pretty comfortably deal with anything on the board, with the
yep,
exception of another Primarch, which really needs to fight one another. So
yeah,
if you're tending to fight people who don't have Primarchs, just stick your Primarch in with a bunch of tactical Marines or despoilers,
yeah.
and actually, add an apothecary in there as well. It makes the despoilers more survivable. The Feel No Pain doesn't confer onto the Primarch. He can't
The
he can't do that,
fearlessness does though.
but it does indeed. And that's
Yeah,
another thing. They will never back down either, which
yeah.
is great. So, as an alternative to a Herald, having a Primarch with 20 despoilers
It's a
is
great idea.
really frightening.
Yeah,
You can add in a character in there if you want to take challenges. You've of course got, you could Apothecary can take challenges.
your unit
Um,
sergeant.
yeah, Unit Sergeant can take challenge. And the brilliant thing about a Primarch in a despoiler squad that isn't tied up in a challenge is your Primarch has precision strikes. So when you roll to hit, you go, right, I want this one on the apothecary, I want this one and this one here, I want this one on the captain or whatever, I want this one here. So you can pick off individual models against your opponent as long as you're not tied up in it. And I found that a much better strategy than
Yeah,
having 10 Terminators and a Primarch. Have two, go for 10 Terminators as one unit, and then a Primarch and a bunch of Despoilers and another. Now you've got two very scary
yeah.
close combat units, and that I think that tends to be the way that I would play rather than just putting all my eggs in one basket.
Completely agree. Could not concur harder. Okay, countering. So, like I said, I think I used to start off this edition by thinking, what the hell is my opponent going to take and how am I going to counter
Yeah,
this?
yeah.
So, I think this is very pertinent. And I think actually, I think again, we've seen a shift in the last year or so back to countering as the prevalence and the rise of, especially Mechanicum. Maybe they're so solar. I still think they're quite an underrepresented army, but certainly the rise of Mechanicum in events and in kind of metas has meant people being like, I can't deal with all of these
Yeah.
toughness 5. I can't deal with all of these all these like multi-wound high toughness models. I just don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
So countering is something that is certainly a consideration, especially if you're going to events. Like if you know that you're playing Bobby down the road and he's got, you know, 1,000 Suns army, you know roughly what he's going to take. You can build quite a harsh counter to it, or you can just, you know, like I said, play your own game. But it's certainly worth bearing in mind how you're going to counter your counter potential opponents. So, you know, on the balance of probabilities, you're going to face legions more often than not. But you know, I think if you're going to a 24 player event now, you're probably going to come up against at least one Mechanicum army over the course of a weekend. Would you agree?
Yes.
Seeing what you've
Yes.
seen at our recent events anyway, right?
Yes. Yeah. 100%. You'll face at least one solar or mech list
Yeah.
in an event. Yeah.
Okay, so there are some units that are common or frequently expected. Plan a list so it's got a way to deal with the common threats. So, what
Mm.
are the common threats? What's your answer to Contemptors, a Leviathan, or a Thanatar? Can
Yeah.
you kill AV-14, maybe even AV-14 with a flare shield? Especially when we talk about mech, like a lot of the stuff comes with flare
Mm.
shields straight out the packet. So,
Mm.
at the end of the scale, do you have enough output to deal with a horde or big units of tactical marines or thalax? What's your counter to a deep strike? Are you going to get completely and utterly shafted?
Yeah.
How do you cope with night fighting and its range limitations? And important to remember, counter doesn't necessarily mean kill. Sometimes it's enough just to neuter a unit or
Yeah.
tarp it, so it's not
That's a really good point, actually. Should we take these
really good
ones
point.
point by point? Because I
I
think there's
agree.
lots of useful things. You know,
Your
it's
answer
just
to a contemptor and a Leviathan or a Thanatar is also likely going to be, can you kill out AV-14, right?
yeah. So it's interesting. I would never shoot at a Contemptor or a Leviathan or a Thanatar, really, unless I was confident that I could kill it in one turn.
I agree with you.
Like, I think I would never pour fire into a Leviathan if I thought I could only get rid of two wounds. I think that it would have to be. I think that that's probably the strategy I would always use with Contemptors and Leviathans, which is that if you're going to kill it straight away.
Yep.
It's got its ability to return fire is too powerful that you really don't want to get in a second round of return fire in it because you haven't been able to kill it first turn.
Yeah, I totally
You
agree.
might be unlucky and go, oh, it's alive on one wound. That's annoying. But you can kill but you'll be able to take it down somehow. That's what I would say. I think the other thing for me, so for my Alpha Legion, I think you guys have heard a lot of me talk about this on the channel. Is
Well, you did an
I
interesting list breakdown, didn't you? So if you've not
yeah,
heard about it and understand your thought process behind it, then is that up on that's up on the
Patreon,
Patreon, correct?
yeah,
So
yeah.
head over there
So
and check that
I
out.
I would always take Grav. I think is really reliable because it
Oh,
wounds on twos
hmm.
and it goes on to their inbund saves, and that's the case for all automata, so Thanatars, but also Contemptors and Leviathans. Very, very good. And when I started taking that en masse, I think initially it threw an awful lot of people. I think people are more wise to my um, Proteus land speeders now, and more savvy to it. And I think that people are kind of being able to counter those, especially with Duredios with las cannons. You can just double them out if you stay still and they get no shrouded. But I find Grav really useful. Of course,
Yeah,
las cannons are going to be massively useful. Melter I found useful to a point with Leviathans, but if it's something like a Salamander's Leviathan or whatever, you're like, oh my God, I'm
yeah,
winning. I think you win that on fives, right? I
yeah,
think because it's like -1. So, um, and the same with Iron Hands. So I think you got to really be confident that you
yeah.
can
Those
take these
guys.
things down. Otherwise, don't do it. And then the other thing I would say is that heavy conversion beamers are massively useful against contemptors leviathans because you can blind them. So if you make them
Yep.
weapon skill one and ballistic skill one, that's going to serve you really, really well. Thanatars less like blinding it sounds good in principle. Often these things are not really in close combat, so the weapon skill one isn't going to hurt it too much. And often you see the plasma mortar and then it's not snap firing. Weapon skill one, it still allows it to fire. It's
Yeah.
just that it will be subtracting one. So, and then they've got a third of a chance to hit. So I think that, yeah, blinding Thanatos sounds good in principle. But it's probably better to blind the one with the laser
The
laser cannon or
Calyx.
whatever. But often that's Paragon Metal. I don't think you can blind.
I don't
You
think you
can't
can. No.
reduce statistics of Paragon models. So yeah. How about you? How about yourself? Contemptors, Leviathan, Thanatars.
Totally agree on the. I think if you need to think wise about how much firepower you invest in trying to take them down.
Yeah.
They are their outputs can be. There's always this kind of a sort of sum I try and do in my head of like what's their prospective output next turn, and is it worth
Yeah.
the input I'm about to put into it this turn?
Exactly right. Exactly.
Um, like is it a fair trade? Am I going to spend 800 points worth of shooting to take down a
Yeah.
350 point model that can potentially do 200 points worth of damage back the next turn, or am I
Yeah.
better investing that firepower into something else? So I
Yeah.
tend to try and sort of play that little mental game with myself first time round. Um, I would normally, and this is the thing, see, I don't actually normally, especially in my Iron War, is this, I don't have a lot of um, low AP. And by low AP, I mean like AP1, AP2 stuff.
Yeah.
Um, just because I'm a really big fan of like solid slug weaponry. So I like to take lots of auto cannons and heavy bolters and, well, shrapnel cannons and things like that. And sort of small to medium arms fire has always been particularly effective for me. So um, I tend to actually normally go and hit them in close combat. I think like ranged AV-14, I can comfortably take down as an Iron Warrior with auto cannons or things such as the aforementioned Leviathan Storm Cannon. Um, and I find actually, again, in that particular instance, that's a lot more effective. Then I'd much rather have that because it's a significantly lower points investment. Like 10 Iron Havocs with auto cannons is like over 100 points cheaper than 10 Iron Havocs with las cannons. In fact, it's
Mm.
15 points for a las cannon for an Iron Havoc, whereas it's a
Yeah.
free upgrade to have an auto cannon. So it's
Yeah.
150 points for 10 guys. So I never struggle with armor. Other like other dreadnought chassis, again, Grav's always kind of quite a good one. But I've actually taken to Grav in combat recently in that particular. Like characters with graviton maces, I found pretty good.
Yeah.
Or I might utilize something such as your humble javelin, or as I just waved to the camera a few minutes ago, some Grav Proteus land speeders as well. So
Yeah.
um, I think I tend to get my answers to what can take down a conventional Leviathan or Thanatar from other sources rather than your traditional
Hmm.
one.
Yeah. Okay. Well, killing armor 14, a little bit easier for an Iron Warrior, but what I can
Piece of
say
cake if you're an armor
is,
wearer, mate.
yeah, but not very. It's actually quite hard to do that with las cannons, believe it or
It
not,
is remarkably so.
because I think you're fishing for sixes. I
Fives to
think
glance, six
fives.
to
Yes.
pen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So not that useful.
I mean, with a flare shield, you're talking like you can only glance it.
Yeah, exactly right. So I think that in that scenario, melter bombs, chain fists, if you want to get up close, far away, heavy conversion beamer,
Arachnus
classically,
heavy las cannon from the Deredeo.
twin linked and sunder as
And
well.
two
So
shots
massive
as
beams.
well, and
Yes,
strength 10 and AP1. So
yes,
it's got everything
yeah,
you could possibly want. It's on it's on a, and it's also on a mobile and survivable chassis in itself as well.
exactly, yeah. So there's a couple of options for you guys, and also the lesser seen strength 10 um, neutron
Neutron beam
blast
laser.
beam laser on the sabers might be a
Yeah,
good way
yeah, or a
good way
Sikaran
to use it.
Venator if you're a
Yep,
complete maniac.
exactly right, exactly right.
Rob,
Um,
let's
yeah,
answer at the other end of the scale. Do you have output
mm,
to deal with Horde or big units of tactical marines or Thalax? Are we just going to say just take heavy bolter rapiers and move on with life?
yeah.
Yeah.
So all of those things, absolutely. Heavy bolter rapiers. I have been trying actually. Heavy bolter javelins. Excellent,
Yes.
really, really good.
Yeah.
Very survivable, mobile, can react. And really good about Thalax. The Thalax are always like shooting and moving away, so they
All
can just
right.
like the speeders
Yeah.
can just like hop over things, and then you kind of go "Brr," get a beat on them and shoot them.
Or
So
also,
yeah,
as friend of the show, will attest to as well. Volkite Proteus land speeders.
very good. Been using lots of those recently.
Yeah.
Very good. Two with two um
Culverins.
culverins, excellent, exactly the same. So quite survivable,
Yeah.
mobile. 20 ships, like a little mobile heavy
And
support
that
squad. Brilliant.
fast attack slot is so underutilized when it
Yeah,
comes to these. Because, like, yes, you can put some rapiers in there, but then might want some contemptors and you might want tech marines
yeah,
or some elite terminators and some apothecaries, which you're going to need. So, like, where does everything fit together? Whereas if you can think about what you want from an army overall and then look at ways of what actually, like, 5 into 4 doesn't go, where
100%.
can I farm some of that output to?
Yeah, yeah,
Um, What's your counter to deep strike? This is a very contentious topic
yeah.
because
Oh,
this
the
was a
big,
massive problem at the start of
yeah,
this edition, which was just everyone and their mother and their mother's dog and
yeah,
their stepfather had an augury scanner,
yeah.
and it became
So,
oppressive.
yeah. So I think there's three things I would say.
Hmm.
So the first one is, of course, augury scanners.
Yep.
Great against pushing infiltrators away from your force,
Yep.
and it obviously gives you a free intercept. So massively useful and almost an auto. Well, it is an auto include on heavy support squad.
Yep.
The second thing is, I think you're always going to want to take, a master of signals. We've done a whole
Mm,
like hour show about how useful that is.
no,
Really great value,
poor guy.
and the fact that it can disorder a deep strike, if it's more than one unit deep striking, is massively useful. And he comes with an augury scanner, so that's really useful. The other one I think is around counters to deep strikes is, and this is about the way you play. So I think that. You have to be really careful when you've got like a mass deep strike force, and you really need to think about your deployment and castling up. If you know that you've got a deep strike force coming on turn one, if it's a drop pod force, and I think that you need to think really carefully about, if you know a drop pod force is coming in, how are you deploying your units to screen to almost
Hmm.
take that initial assault or in the initial shooting, and how are you protecting all those units that have got all those intercepts and you can use on your and that you can use as well. I also think if you're countering with deep strike as well, and you kind of see an army that goes deep, lots of deep strike, I think you really need to think about taking a second movement reaction, just to help you unlock a second
Intercept.
intercept.
Yeah,
Yeah, so
I
I think
agree.
that's, if I've got a deep striking army, I would always tend to go, okay, well, I'll choose a force I'll choose a warlord trait that gives me a second movement reaction, because you just need as much firepower as possible, and that will allow like dreadnoughts and things to be able to intercept, which will be useful because lots of those things cannot, unless they've got a helical, cannot get a free
Yeah.
intercept. So yeah, so definitely, I mean, there's four parts to that deep striking answer, but sometimes it's just you're just going to be blown away. Like
Yep.
sometimes you're just going to be assaulted and you're going to be pinned, but also like having fearless and actually having a herald or a banner is useful, because that can pump out a leadership 10 bubble to other nearby units. So you're not just relying on that fearless, you're also relying on all the leadership being slightly higher
No,
as
I
well. So
completely agree with you.
yeah, so something to
Um,
consider, and think about where you put that herald. It needs to be,
yeah,
all the units
it needs to
almost
be
need to be
central.
touching it. Yeah, exactly.
Correct.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, how do you cope with night fighting and its range limitations?
Not too much of an issue. Again, augury scanners,
Yeah.
tech marines I've found massively useful
Hmm.
with the Cognis Signum. They
Yep.
ignore Shrouded, they give night fight, they allow you to hit on two. So yeah, tech marines. If you haven't looked at a tech marine before, as an alternative, a slightly cheaper alternative to Master of
Awesome
Signals,
signals. Yeah.
but I think for me, tech marines are almost auto includes for rapiers, and the other reason I say that is because rapiers get plus Legion artillerists get +1 leadership. A tech marine has with the Cognis has night vision, and then is leadership 8. So actually, that unit then becomes leadership 9. So it's actually quite hard to make them fail a morale check from there.
That's some good synergy, Rob. I like that
Yeah,
a lot.
yeah,
And I think actually, to be fair, you've already covered this point in the previous slide, which is tar pitting.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Don't think we need to cover old ground again. Um, and this is the last point of the five, which is contingencies. Even the best laid plans fall apart in contact with the enemy, especially when the dice starts betraying. We've all been there.
Yeah,
We've all thrown dice in the bin. If your unit that's supposed to do that one job fails, do you have another option? Are your units designed to do a single job, or do they have versatility in their role? And if your list is built around a specific mechanism, how do you cope if your opponent has a hard counter, e.g., Master of Signals and Deep Striking?
Very tough. I mean, this is, I think, where you're kind of not just playing the game, but you're playing the player as well.
And you're also playing the
Um,
mission as well. You play
yeah,
the game and not the occasion, remember?
I think that's important actually, and not losing sight of actually, if you lose your close combat unit, you don't send in a weaker unit hoping that it will be good in close combat. Like, play exactly say, play the mission,
Mm.
and try and outscore your opponent that way. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I think experience is um, really important here, and knowing what to do in certain situations if the plan starts to fall apart. Your close combat unit gets destroyed by a Scorpius on the opening salvo, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's just absolutely savage. So, yeah,
Okay. So I'm going to raise a point in relation to the last bullet point there, which is your list, if your list is built around a specific mechanism, how do you cope if your opponent has a hard counter, e.g. a Master of Signals and Deep Striking? If you've got a large deep striking army and your opponent has invested 250 to 300 points in countering deep strike, there's a very simple answer there. Don't deep strike.
mm,
Just there's nothing. If you've got a Day of Revelation army, you don't have to deep strike. You can start off on the board, and at this
that's
point, you've
interesting.
in theory got yourself 15% more points than your opponent. Like they're still quick, they're still fast. You can still move from cover to cover. They still get a lot of their Legion buffs. Like it's gonna be all right. Like if your opponent's sitting there thinking, "Oh, finally, I've got a Master of Signals and I've bought every signal, single unit I possibly can and an augury scanner, and I'm gonna absolutely fucking smash this guy apart as
Yeah,
soon as he comes down." You can just be like,
I
I'll
won't
just
be
put on the board,
distracted.
mate. And at
Yeah,
which point his willy will droop and you can just
yeah.
go and knock him over the head, regular
Yeah,
style.
that's interesting actually. Yeah, because the lightning says he's probably castled up right in the corner as well, so it gives
Yeah.
you really like full
Gives
full
you
swathe of the board. Yeah,
free free reign to go and jump and just play your game.
interesting. Yeah,
So
okay,
don't
yeah,
worry about it. You're gonna be all right. Yeah, if you bought drop pod assault army, fair enough.
that's going to be
You know,
harder
you're
to yeah.
a bit railroaded there, but you're already a top lad. You're already a winner because you bought
Yeah,
a drop pod assault army.
yeah, exactly. It's a high risk, high reward. So I think you know what you're
Yeah.
getting into, right? Yeah,
And
exactly.
again, we did a whole episode on drop pod assault. So yeah, go and check that over in the Patreon. But yeah, like I said, you're already a winner if you bought drop pod assault. So don't you worry about that.
Okay.
I personally like to I don't tend to have units that will do multiple things necessarily. I tend to be in the case of I would like um my units to be relatively focused, but at the same time, I would like to have them overlap with other units so that if something does go wrong, at least I've got some degree of secondary kind of backup plan. Um, but at the same time, like, yeah, I think this is difficult if you start to then put eggs in one basket. Like, what happens if someone pings your Spartan first, like your Spartan full of your ultimate close combat cataphracti armored Death Star that now is essentially largely nullified for the remainder of the game. There's a huge
Yeah.
points investment. Like, what do you do? Like, I think the advice is just be not cautious necessarily, but considerate.
Mm, yeah. 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 Interesting. Cool. Right. Well, should we take a look at my list? I
I'd
think
love
it's
to.
this. Okay. Well,
Why
let
don't
me
you
run you
talk us
through
through?
this.
Yeah,
So, and perhaps this will kind of call upon everything that we've talked about, and I'll talk about why I've taken that unit.
do it.
And but this is a tournament list, so this is kind of geared up for scoring, geared up for a little bit of everything. It's a jack of
Yeah,
all trades, I think, is what I would say. So I'm going to start off with. I see what I'm going to start off with my troops because I think that's probably a better way to deal with this. So I've got a 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 man despoiler squad, and I've gone for 3 power more, sorry, 4 power mores in total. Um, so power more's great, it's +2 strength, I think, and then they're AP3. So
AP3,
they
but
so they're
going at initiative.
yes, so they're really good at dealing with other despoilers or attack marines. I've gone for a tactical squad. This has been so it's 15 man. It's got a sergeant, and no close combat weapons. Just like this is just for scoring. It's got a Nuncio Vox and a Legion Vexilla. And then I've got two tac squads which are exactly the same. So they've got a Rhino with a Heavy Bolter and Searchlights, and then each of those tac squads has got a Nuncio Vox as well. I've added in the Nuncio because I'm always a little bit frightened of Night Fight, especially if I'm facing Night Lord. So just having that, being able to ignore the penalty to Night Fight is just useful if I lose like 25% guys in
Yep.
the shooting. And then we've talked lots before. If you want to see us talking about Ultramarines, but basically, I've got a Heavy Bolter and Searchlight, so that can draw a bead on units, and then I can synergize that with other units, and
Yep.
then they'll get plus one BS. So over to the I'll go to the apothecaries. So I've got two apothecaries. Well, three in total, but I've got two normal apothecaries. One's going to go with the Despoiler squad, and one's going to go with the tax squad. So I'm really relying on Heart of the Legion there. They're just going to, the plan is just for them to stay on objective and have a four-up feel no pain. And then let's move over to the HQ. So I've got a Tartarus Herald, and I've chosen Tartarus because it's pretty much the same points as a normal Herald, but he
Yeah.
comes with an extra
An
wound.
extra wound.
Yeah, an extra wound. So the Thunderhammer is slightly more expensive to buy, but the Thunderhammer is slightly cheaper. So I think that it works out basically exactly the same cost. I just needed to paint up a Tartarus Herald. So he will be my Warlord just because he's got the extra wound, more survivable in that way. And also Tartarus is great because they can run.
Yep.
So it is literally, I'm taking that just for the extra wind. I've got a Master of Signals. So we talked about why I've got we've talked before about Master of Signals, why it's useful. So again, that's about, I suppose, not only is that about buffing my 8-man Volkite Culverin squad, heavy sports squad, that's also about dealing with deep strikes. So that's why that he's in there. And then I've also got a Herald with a Thunderhammer and a Warhawk jump pack. Now, that Herald is going to be running with my close combat unit, and this is really, I would say, my only dedicated close combat. So it's interesting that if that unit goes, that Locutarus unit goes, I would be in. I would play a shooting game. I would know, and a shooting and scoring game, I can no longer really compete with my opponent in close combat. So that he's going to be rolling with a 9-man Locutarus squad, and the sergeant's got a Thunderhammer and a combat shield because that's what was modelled. It's not a particularly great choice, but just giving me a little cheeky 6-up if I need it. And then the Locutarus, they all come with power swords, but they rend on a 5 and 6-up. So they're massively useful actually about
Mm.
taking on dreadnoughts. That's
Yep.
really why they're there. And they can often hit on 2s or 3s just because of their special rule. Um, in that unit, as I said, I've got the Legion Herald. So that's a unit with 2 Thunderhammers, and then I've got an apothecary in that unit as well. So not only is that unit fearless, it's pretty decent in close combat, and it's pretty survivable because all those guys are 2-up save, and they've got a 2-up save, 2 wounds, and a feel no pain as well.
Yep.
Over to elites. So we've got 3 other elites. I've got 2 rapier batteries, and these are the Gravis Heavy Bolter rapiers. So these are kind of my anti-Thalex, anti-Solar Orcs. If I could have fit another one in, that would have been great, but I simply didn't have the points, and nor did I have the slots to add a Tech Marine in. So what I'm relying on there really is my rhinos lighting up targets for me for them to be able to maximize their 48 inches, and that's what happens, because I've got 2 heavy bolts on the rhinos. So
Yep.
another 8 shots, right? I've got a Contemptor with double conversion beam cannon with a helical targeting array. Helical targeting array, we haven't really talked about it too much, but it's useful if you want to ignore a shroud. Stay still, switch it on, you get intercept for free. You can't return fire, but it ignores people's shrouds. So if you're kind of like, right, I need that Spartan to die, but I also need like a 4+ to glance it, or a 5 to blow, to get the pen. You just really don't want your opponent shrouding against it. So I
Yeah.
found so the helical's useful in that situation. And then the Contemptuous Dreadnought, the second one, is a double Gravis Melter. I find that quite useful, being right at the front of the force and it just makes your opponent a little bit wary, especially if they've got Land Raiders and Spartans, about coming too close. So that's usually fairly central. And yeah, it just makes your opponent a bit wary about going too close to it. It's a good elite killer as well as a tank killer. I think you could argue that really you don't need the helical because you're going to be kind of moving around an awful lot. But there are going to, exactly as I said before, there are going to be occasions where it's really important that you don't allow your opponent to shroud. So just staying still and kind of going, right, I'm going to switch it on. I'm not going to allow you to shroud as a result of this. Yeah, is important. Over to fast attack. So this is a pretty. I think I've used every slot apart from two in the troops actually.
Yeah, you've done very well. I'm very
Yeah,
impressed.
so I've got two squadrons of javelins. I've got one javelin on its own, and then two in one slot. So they're all armed with las cannon and multi melter. Again, I found that massively useful. And if you pair those with rhinos, so the rhino hits something first, and then if the javelins are targeting the same unit, they'll hit on +1 BS.
Yeah.
So often you can get javelins hitting on twos, which is really,
Yes,
really,
really, really
really
handy.
nice
Really, really
on
good.
the las cannons. And then I've obviously mentioned my Locataris, and then over to the heavy. So I've mentioned the Volkite Culverin again. So this is, I suppose it's a similar job to just heavy bolters. It's AP5, but really this is like solar orcs killer, marine killer, and just great for the deflags. Lots of shots. This is kind of like that's my weight of fire unit. I
Yeah.
think is the best way to describe it. I've got Leviathan Dreadnought. It's got, I don't think it's got it on there, but it has definitely got two Leviathan siege cannons. I would definitely will check that because,
Yeah.
but it's definitely, I think it definitely has because I think
Don't want
it's
to be
like,
an illegal list, Rob.
I need to check, I need to check that then. But let's just assume it's a double storm cannon because I believe it is. Um, and I again, that's a similar situation, which is that's going to be really good at killing brutes. It's going to be really good at killing solar orcs. That's going to be really good at killing kind of Thalax as well.
Mm.
And that's why that one's in. But also really good, similar job, anti-tank. Like that can just
Yeah.
glance out a Land Raider really, really reliably. And then finally, um, my Predator. So I usually take in this list one Predator with a heavy conversion being cannon, and one Contemptor in the corner with conversion beamers, one Predator in the corner. Get them in the crossbeam. And I found if you've not played around with the Decurion
I
Locust
was
yet,
about to
I've
say that's a lovely choice.
yeah.
Really lovely.
So I found the Decurion Locust really valuable for the heavy conversion beam cannon. So there's two reasons. The first one is that it can return. It's not called return fire. It's called Locust Strike,
Yeah.
but it can return fire, essentially, with that heavy conversion beam cannon, which means that people are often unwilling to shoot at it, knowing that it can return fire. If you've got a heavy support squad and
Yeah.
it's got and you kind of like, oh, I'm going to shoot at it. You go, I'm going to return fire. Then you just land that play. It's worth that sacrifice. And the other thing is that the Turing Locus comes with an inbuilt Nuncio Vox, and that allows it to twin link its own weapon.
Yeah.
So that's massively useful. If you're unlucky and roll a 12 on a scatter,
Yeah.
it just allows you to twin link it. I've got other Nuncio boxes on the board to help with that, but I just found that being able to twin link its own weapon is really reliable. So
Oh,
that's my list. So I think it's just does a little bit of everything. It
where
could deal
it's
with
where it is
Mechanicum.
weaknesses, Rob.
Oh, close combat, 100%. So I think that probably what I favor shooting an awful lot because I tend to take a second shooting reaction. I think you can really, I think a simple one for this list would be that the double gravis melter cannon, you could just give that one fist,
Hmm.
um, and then that would allow you to add just a little bit of close combat in there, which would be quite nice. I mean, you have the spoiler squad; they're not going to take on elites, but they are going to be able to, fight other tacticals pretty easily. But I think this list can deal with some solar. I think it can deal with some Mechanicum. I think it can deal with some demons, and I think it can deal with Marines. What I don't think it does is lean into any one particular thing and does it really well. It's not like a Raven Guard deep striking, like
Yeah.
10 deliverers and 15 Dark Furies or whatever. It's not that kind of list. It's just kind of like a jack of all trades list, a master of none.
Yeah, I
And we'll see
really
how this
like it.
goes.
I really like it. It's very Ultramarines-y.
Yes,
That's
isn't
the
it
biggest
just?
compliment that I can pay it.
Isn't it? Isn't it just? Yes, and just say no right of war. I find the Logos Lectora a little bit too constrictive in the sense that sometimes I might want to deep strike the Locutaris, in the backfield, maybe try and take that Scorpius down or something like that that's
Yeah,
been plaguing me. So I just find it, lots of
that's
people love
fair.
the
That is
Locutaris,
fair.
but I just find it a little bit restrictive. Ah, I don't think I did upgrade it with a second siege rod. I'm gonna have to ask Pardo to let me change that and find the password.
Oh,
Oh
gonna
no,
ask very
I'm gonna get in
nicely.
so much trouble. I'm gonna get in
Yeah.
so much trouble.
Okay, right. So, closing thoughts, Rob. I will. I'll ask you first. Like, what have we learned on this magical mystical journey of the last two
Oh,
hours?
um, well, it's been great to go through. I guess like strategies, how you would deal with stuff. I think it's always useful to have those
Hmm.
like general chats and just going back to basics, going back to first principles. I think is just massively useful.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's always just good just to kind of reiterate it's kind of certain things really, and just get a little bit of different perspective. Even just the conversation aspect, just talking something through with someone, I think can really kind of really give you kind of clarity on certain stuff.
Yeah,
I personally think that we do, you know, we share lists and stuff all the time. Like,
yeah,
we're in various kind of groups. We're on the WhatsApp community, and we are talking in our own little kind of, cliques, and we're always sort of sharing lists and list building ideas. And I think that we tend to come, like I said, come from things from quite diametrically opposed. Um, I think, to an issue, I think where Rob is very analytical and likes to pays enormous consideration to kind of every point that's spent in the list. I think what I often come to it from I really like these things. How can I build a list around them to make them not crap or make them work somewhat? So I think mine's probably a little bit more emotive, but I think I personally think from a closing thoughts perspective, I'm really desperate to hear what other people think. I really, really am looking forward to hopefully seeing all of those comments where people are telling us like what they like to include, how they build lists, what their key considerations are, what things are an absolute auto include and what things are a never include. I think that's actually, when we get the battlefield data from a different community other to the one that we kind of play in, which is, largely localized to the south and the Midlands of England, like I'm really, really, really keen to see how people approach this topic from our global, worldwide audience. Um, Anything else you'd like to add before we say
no,
our
no,
final thank yous and goodbyes?
no. I thought that was a good discussion.
Good, good, good. Right. Final thank you to our sponsors, Gator 3D Printing. Dan is a long-term supporter of the show. He's very active over on the WhatsApp community, answering all of your 3D print questions too. Has an awful lot of super high quality prints from some kind of exclusive stuff from some of your favorite 3D sculptors. Beowulf, if you need bits and bobs to flesh out your despoiler squad, your tack squads, your apothecaries, tech marines, for instance, all of that good stuff, head on over to Beowulf. Also, if you're interested in a modular Mordheim board, go and see that too. Lee and I mentioned that in the Death Guard show, but it's still phenomenal. Um, and if you like the idea of printing your stuff at home or getting your preferred third party to do it for you, then please head over and see our friends at Sacris Mundus. They supply files for various 3D prints for terrain. So if you want that kind of Tuscan city or you want to live in your own 3D printed hab block, then now's the time to do it. You can find them on Cults 3D, My Mini Factory, and Patreon, and you can scale their stuff up and down to suit whatever you would like. And then the Wall of Champions. Um, I literally have lost count of the number of top tier Praetors that we have, which I shouldn't do because we've been manufacturing merchandise for them for the last 6 months. So we really should have a pretty good handle on how many there are. But
Mhm.
we've got something like 700 supporters over on Patreon now, which is just absolutely mind blowing. And we thank every single one of you for all of the support. It's enabling us to do some really, really exciting projects in 2025 that we wouldn't have had the opportunity to be doing before. So thank you so much. But a special thanks to our Heresy Hammer top tier Praetor Patreon supporters. Um, these guys are receiving their merchandise at the moment and will be about to restart receiving. I'm going to say it. I think it's the best thing that we've done, and we've done some pretty incredible stuff. I am
It
more
looks pretty
excited.
sick.
I'm more excited for our next round of Praetor rewards than I think I've been for anything, not just heresy related, but anything in quite a long time.
We need Lee to show it off. I can't
Yeah, I
believe it's
think
been allowing people just to
I don't think we've had
wait
a
for so long.
final we've had a pre-production sample, but not like a production sample yet. So I
Yeah,
think I
yeah,
think they're coming imminently.
yeah.
But thanks hugely. If you're interested, we'll put a teaser out over on the Patreon. So even if you're not in a position where you can support or you'd like to support yet, you can still join the Patreon to receive updates. You just won't be able to access any of the content. If you want to access the content, you can do so for as little as £3. A lot of the stuff that Rob and I have talked about this evening, we've covered in extensive detail over in the Patreon in various series we've done over the last 2.5 years. Um, it's £3 a month, and you can gain access to all of those, the entire back catalogue of videos and everything we produce going forwards. We produce 2 additional shows every month that cover things with a kind of a greater degree of tactical depth. Um, but you can also choose to upgrade that particular tier to include things like giveaways, access to our exclusive Facebook group, all of our event materials that we put up, early access to event tickets, and also some phenomenal rewards as well. And if you're interested in just giving it a little go, there is a 7-day free trial you can take advantage of too. Right, that's the last time I'm going to mention the Patreon tonight. No, it's not because I have to do it on this slide as well. Right, okay. Don't forget to follow us on at Heresy Hammer Show over on Instagram, and continue for the time being to tag your miniatures with hashtag Heresy Hammer until Zuckerberg decides to mess with it again and nothing shows up anymore. Importantly, if you've got all the way through this 2 and a bit hours of us yammering on about how to win your games of Heresy, or certainly not lose them in the list building phase, then please hit the subscribe button, comment down below, give it a like, give it a share, and let us know your thoughts. You can also, if you've got more thoughts, it's too many thoughts, in fact, why not collate them all together and drop us an email to heresyhammer30k@gmail.com. We will be recording our community show that we do once a month later this week,
Yeah.
where we tend to go through kind of all of your correspondences. So get those in quick. Um, Obviously, like I said, patreon.com/heresyhammer to support the show. Your help and support is much, much, much appreciated. Um, you can now listen to the audio of all the shows over on your favorite podcasting platform too. So it's over on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Podcasts, Google Podcasts, I think is a thing, Podbean, yada, 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 yada. And also join in on the What Is App community as well. There is a link in the link tree, which is link.tree/heresyhammer, or jump over to Instagram and it's in the bio there, and I'll post it in the show notes, etc. etc. Right, now I've done the sales pitch. Anything else to add before we chip off and go to bed?
No, looking forward to seeing you guys and what you guys have to think about the episode.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I want to hear. I want everyone who watches to comment. I'm expecting thousands of comments down below, and I promise you, if you put a comment down below, I will respond to it, even if it's not very nice about me. So, um, and on that note, I'll bid you a fond farewell. Say goodbye, Rob.
Bye bye, Rob.
Finally, it's only taken 2.5 years, but he's finally got the joke. Okay, doke. Right. Thanks, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Bye bye.
Bye.
My controls haven't popped up. I can't stop the recording.
No, it's just going on. I was about to stop recording myself.